Good evening. My name is Peter Lowe, and I'm the director of the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. And I'm very pleased to be joined this evening by three colleagues. Rebecca Major is an assistant professor at the University of Windsor and an expert on Indigenous politics and participation. Amanda Bittner is a professor of political science at Memorial University, Canada's leading expert on political leaders. And David Walmsley is the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, a small newspaper run out of Toronto, Ontario. I'm sitting in Toronto at the University of Toronto, which sits on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit. And I feel very fortunate to be living and working here on this part of Turtle Island. And I'm very thankful for those who've come before and have made it possible for us to do this. We're going to talk today about political institutions and expertise in Canada. How might, for example, our political institutions and the representation they enable be broadened and made deeper? How do we bring more views of people, the views of more people, to the table in our politics? And how, too, should we think about not only the role of institutions, but also the role of experts and expertise? How can we broaden and deepen the expertise, the voices that we bring to the table, not only in addressing this COVID pandemic, but also addressing other pressing issues? What motivates this is that among a lot of the work that's been done by the Royal Society of Canada in learning about how we can improve Canada over the pandemic, I've had the great honor of leading a group that's been examining these issues in great depth. A lot of interesting things have happened during the pandemic. Our political institutions, for example, have responded with great policy vigor. We've had massive changes in how we think about income supports, changes in how people are working, where they're working from, rules about what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do. But it's also happened at a time when many legislatures have been inactive on other fronts, when certain democratic practices have been suspended. And it's also happened at a time when the relative role of politicians to experts really has changed. And we've seen politicians defer to experts in terms of final policy decisions in a way that is actually quite rare in Canada. So to wrestle a little bit with what we might learn coming out of the pandemic around how we can broaden and deepen our political institutions, the representation that they facilitate, and how we can think about expertise in maybe a broader way. We've got this great group of colleagues with us. So I'm just going to start a conversation, and I'm not the moderator of this. I'm just one part of it. So I'll just start off a conversation with a question for Amanda, and then we can go around the table, and we'll keep the conversation going for the next hour. At the tail of the hour, I'll leave it to David to say goodbye on behalf of all of us, and he'll be the clock watcher. So Amanda, let me just put a question to you, and then we can go from there. When you look back over the pandemic, what are the things that our governing institutions, including but not limited to politicians and legislatures, but what are the things that our governing institutions have done well, and what are the things that they've done less well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the interesting thing about this pandemic, and I hate to ever say, oh, we have some things that we can take from this, and this is a good thing, because it's been terrible for most people. But we've learned a lot, right? So the pandemic has laid bare a lot of things that were true about society for a long time, right? So basic gender inequality that is systemic, racial, that is causing problems and has been causing problems for a lot of people for a long time. And I think that, your point about expertise is a really important one, is a really interesting and important question, because I think that when decisions are made as a result of research, as a result of listening to experts, usually better policies are the result. Now, part of that takes deliberation and discussion, and it's really hard to do a full-on deliberation during a pandemic when emotions are higher, when things are particularly challenging. But there are a few things that have come out of this that I think governments have learned a little bit about. What are the needs of our people? So thinking about, gender inequality, and in particular, the unequal burdens of care, both in the home and outside the home and in the workplace, largely borne by a particular set of segments of society. And I think that, recent initiatives to think about things like childcare, like things like basic income, these are things that the governments have been considering now that have been an issue for a long time. So, not that I'm super hopeful as a result of this pandemic, but I am hopeful that one of the things that we can continue to do well is to consider these problems that have been seen by many to be intractable, but they aren't. There are solutions to these problems. And if we can rely upon research and expertise expertise, there is potential out there to make society work better, to ensure that people are more equal, and to lead to, better outcomes, let's say.
Thanks very much, Becky. What's your view on this? Where have our institutions done well, and where have they done not so well?
Well, I feel like in watching some of the response to the pandemic, I feel like we're still watching silos, that there are still problems with diversity of knowledge at tables. So you have tables of specialization, perhaps, but I think we need to see more integration between different knowledge groups at the same table, bringing in, maybe not just a table of medical experts, but mix that table up with who's sitting there. That needs to be happening. It happens more at the federal table, but I'm watching what's happening closely in Saskatchewan, as that was my home province. And there has been some serious policy failures coming out of that province during the pandemic. There has been institutional failures. There has been racially charged policy during the pandemic in Saskatchewan, especially when they locked up the North. I won't say locked down the North, I'll say they locked them up, right? And there were people that were not being able to access groceries. And that's a problem, right? And it was very racialized. And then you had small farming communities in the South that were being painted with a very different brush. And so what I watched during a lot of what was going on was a lot of politicians increasing these cleavages through media at times, through press conferences. So that's been really frustrating to watch for me. And again, maybe it's because I'm paying particular attention to the West, and the fact the West has been a hot spot recently. I mean, yes. It's been awful, right? And so many loved ones are over there, and you feel helpless when you're watching policy failures happen, and you feel like there wasn't the right people at the table having conversations. I think that that's problematic. I think that there was government problems too with even messaging, which is why, even the federal government couldn't develop enough trust for people to even download their apps, right? Because I don't think there was very much participation in the end on the apps, on being alerted if, you've been in contact with things like that. So I think that Amanda has illustrated some really good points on some of the things that we've seen exposed, the gender issues, the racial inequalities that have happened. But at the same time, because everybody's at home, I think we've also seen some really good focusing events, good in that there's awareness, right? So I'm just thinking of some of the social movements that were taking place, and the fact that people were shocked there were people on the streets because it was a pandemic. It helped bring awareness to issues. For myself, when I was doing my work, there were times I couldn't even access books because the public was so drawn to certain scholarship by certain authors, which was great. So there were some real positives that came out in awareness, I would say, but it was less in the political and institutional and more in the social. Anyway, yeah, sorry.
No, this is really good. One of the things that's really interesting about the pandemic to me is how different the experience of it has been across Canada. And it's been different in different ways at different times, right? So let's just stick on Saskatchewan for a second. What was the trajectory of things like there in the following sense? Was it like it kind of was in Ontario, that there was really a social consensus and everyone thought the government was doing a great job through the first 6 months of it, but then it started to break down with the second wave and with the third wave? There's another way of asking sort of, when did you see this kind of fissure in how government was making policy around the pandemic come about? Was it early on, or has it only been in later stages of it?
Well, I think that in the beginning stages, in the first and second waves, Saskatchewan just doesn't have the foot traffic in and out of their province that some of the other provinces in Canada have. So they were lucky in some respects, really, I would almost say. Because there wasn't a lot of policy in place. People were calling for measures, doctors were calling for measures. And then we heard that again. And then there was the question of, how are you handling it? Because Mo went through an election.
Right.
And he won and was really like strongly reelected. And then very recently, he's had a leadership review and he passed that too. Right. And I noticed when I see a lot of people on the sidelines, maybe it's because on my social media, it's mostly Indigenous folks that make up the bulk of the interaction I have, but people are just sort of sitting there going, well, but really, were there good choices being made? Is the apology enough? Because, oh, I'm sorry, I should have acted sooner, sort of came out a couple of weeks ago. And people are like, yeah, okay. And it didn't really go anywhere. Nobody really made a big deal about it. There was other news items at the time, but still, I mean, people made a bigger deal about Ken.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can remember that it's only, I mean, as you know, it's only when Ian Rankin loses power in Nova Scotia in August of 2021 that an incumbent loses power during COVID, right? Incumbents were reelected in not in any order. They were reelected in Saskatchewan, in BC, in Newfoundland, and in Labrador, right? So that it was a pretty good time to be an incumbent in some sense. David, what are you seeing in kind of the big picture of the last 18 months? Just from your vantage point, where do you see political institutions functioning well? Where do you think they haven't hit the mark?
Yeah, I think the first question, I think if we recognize that we're all either in the middle of or coming through the same storm, but we're all in very different boats. And the first question has to be, I think, what is the purpose of an institution? And often an institution is something that isn't thought about until you need it. And then if you need it, is it there for you? And so I begin with the duty of care, which is what government's role is. And the big institution would be Parliament. Does anyone remember Parliament? When did it last sit? There's some sort of idea it might pop in for a bit of work next week. Let's hope that happens. And yet the government continued to function in the sense of the permanent government of the Prime Minister's office and the centralized power. But I'm not sure that the public service was able to respond to some of the very significant issues that were brought to bear. The budget that should be a confidence measure in convention was not put to the House federally. But if you also look at institutions far beyond just the political milieu, I think, I would include institutions to include hospitals, to consider the health structure and the health authorities, and to consider nurses and perhaps give them a little bit more time and day in the front line than previously had been recognized. So I think value has gone up when people consider the work that was being done. But the broader sense of the institutions in terms of a test of whether they've worked or they haven't, I think will take time. I think the question will be, was the government there for you in the end? And I think that the bills haven't been paid. And so the judgment of that is still to come. All of what we are in now in fiscal terms is new. And how we respond to that, especially on the economic side with inflationary pressures and such like, and the debt for the next generations, I think is going to be an interesting question that probably is the ultimate question of institutional success or failure, more than just the politicians themselves. It's an extraordinary challenge, and I don't think that if you want to look at the party politics of it federally, all of the parties, to your point about incumbents, all of the parties who went through the recent federal election were returned weaker. That's probably not healthy.
Yeah, the math on how that works is curious, but it's true, right? In an important sense. I mean, the thing that intrigues me on the big picture of it, and it kind of plays onto your point, David, and I'll ask Amanda and Becky to weigh in as they want to, but it's that in some ways governments have taken some credit for what's gotten us through COVID, where in reality, if you want to attribute credit for it, a lot of it goes to those other public institutions you've talked about, the willingness of the healthcare system to bend but not break over the course of it, but also, frankly, just the everyday hard work of everyday people doing the right thing, having their kids home longer than they would like to, forestalling social interactions and time with extended family for more than a year. in many cases. And when government said, look, we actually have to get serious in locking down again, people complying, not because the government actually had any force to do it. We've seen no real demonstration of force, with the exception of border patrols in New Brunswick or something like that, really enforcing lockdowns. But people have followed with kind of common sense responses. And what I wonder sometimes, right, is whether in the slightly longer term, people are going to look back over this period of time and say, wait a second, we were successful because people were willing to make sacrifices. And as you say, there was a lot of money that underwrote that, actually, but it wasn't particularly because governments were good at leading us. It's because people were willing to do the hard things every day to sort of make this work. And then there'll be a reckoning for political institutions. I mean, some of the institutions that worked least, and maybe I'll put this in the form of a question, but some of the institutions that worked least literally over the course of this pandemic were legislatures. The Nova Scotia legislature sat for precisely one day in the first 18 months of the pandemic. And that day was essentially to install a new premier. And yet it functioned. Our federal parliament sat in virtual form, but the amount of actual legislative activity that went on was very low. And yet government spent more money than ever spent before. It raises really important questions, I think, about the necessity of what we think are these core democratic institutions kind of in our politics. Amanda, the legislature, the House of Assembly in Newfoundland and Labrador has not been sitting actually very actively, less than 60 days per year over the last number of years, actually, right? You went through an election during that period of time. What's the nature of not only kind of politics, but the nature of legislative business and the nature of public administration been like over Newfoundland and Labrador over the last 18 months? And what does it tell us about the role of these seemingly central institutions in our politics?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great point. And I feel like I was smirking there as you referred to Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'm fairly confident that I was smirking. And it goes back to the point that David just made about we don't think about institutions until we need to. And so we went through an election and, it was from the perspective of somebody who studies elections and electoral institutions and the way elections ought to be managed, it was a freaking disaster. It was a disaster of epic proportions. Like, we'll go down in the history books as being the most poorly run election in the history of elections in a democratic society.
Just tell us the story of it. I mean, essentially what happened, the timeline of it, because it is remarkable.
It is remarkable. And it's one of those things where, we're a small province. There's only about 500,000 of us citizens that live here. And so I don't know that it's gotten the attention that it deserves. Certainly anybody who studies elections and follows kind of electoral management bodies, which is a really small segment of us, to be fair. We know about it, but really nobody else does. So an election was called, in the middle of a pandemic. This was in the winter of this year, 2021. And the premier at the time had reported that he had engaged in a conversation with the chief electoral officer to say, are you guys prepared for a pandemic election? Can we do this? And he states that he was assured that, yes, no problem. This is going to be just fine. So election was called, short election period. Within a couple of days, we had a major outbreak of a variant. And so everybody was freaking out. There were a whole bunch of changes that were made right away. So right away, he shut down 18 districts, said we're not going to have elections in person in these 18 districts located close to the capital city in St. John's. And then after that, it was realized that actually we got to do this change for everybody. So more changes came to be. So it was going to be mail-in ballots for some and then not mail-in ballots for others. Then that changed to mail-in ballots for everyone. But nobody knew how to order a mail-in ballot. And then the website went down. And so folks couldn't get ballots. The deadline for us to send the ballots back kept changing. In the middle of all of this, the chief electoral officer hand-delivered ballots to key members of government as well as opposition leaders because they were on his route home. And so that was a choice that he made. Later on, he chose to take elections or votes by phone, which is in no part of the legislation. And so things kept changing and the moving goalposts, and it seemed like it was, the chief electoral officer just doing whatever he wanted willy-nilly. And it was particularly confusing for a lot of voters to figure out, okay, where do I even get my ballot? How do I do this? The deadline keeps changing. And the deadline to mail the ballots back was not sufficiently long enough to ensure that really remote and rural communities could actually mail their ballot in on time. So there were a whole bunch of folks who were effectively disenfranchised. And part of that was linguistic. There's a lot of Indigenous communities up north that, needed translation of their ballots and didn't have this option. So, the disenfranchisement was systematic. It was not random. And it spoke to, major problems that we have in society. And when the chief electoral officer was asked, does this concern you that, turnout went way down? He actually said that turnout wasn't his metric and he didn't care about that. And so everybody was like, what is happening over here? So it was a constant, every time he spoke to the media, I thought, oh God, what's going to happen next? And so I think that, folks didn't vote. The government was reelected, sure. But I don't think they can claim a, bold mandate from that particular election, and very little has been done to hold the electoral management body to account. And there were no issues discussed in this election. So the issue of the election became the management of the election, which is not, great for democracy.
Pretty self-referential, right? But I thought, it's a case I watched closely, as you know, but I thought it was in some ways sort of emblematic of the challenge here, right? Which was how are these institutions going to get back to normal, right? And I don't know that they were going to necessarily get back to normal. Becky, I want to shift gears a little bit. I mean, one thing that's happened throughout the pandemic, and it's has been just not because of the pandemic, but the issue of reconciliation, or the issues of reconciliation have come back to the top of the agenda with the discovery of unmarked graves at several residential schools, with other related events. What do you think the nature of policymaking? If I can ask the question this way, what do you think the nature of policymaking during COVID-19 has told us about how well we are and how well we are not engaging with Indigenous communities in Canada?
Okay, yeah. So one thing that was very certain about what came out and what was exposed this summer was the fact that so many people were unaware about just general facts about the TRC. Comments you see on social media, how come people didn't tell us about this? So many things, right? And it's like, wow. I thought people at least would have had the TRC on their radar, or the MMIWG on their radar. I found out this spring when I was interacting with someone who spent 25 years working for the Toronto Police Force, not as an officer, just works in one of the buildings in Toronto, didn't know that we had a missing murdered Indigenous woman inquiry. How do you work for a police force in Canada and not know that we've had that inquiry? So there are huge failures. There was a lot of talk when things came out. I had some MPs approach me to have conversations, and then I saw very little follow-up, especially because the election happened. And then after the election, any of the conversations had prior to the election have vanished, which is really unfortunate. I did a lot of political commentary for the election in 2019. There was a lot more awareness of the community-based issues in the media in that election than during the pandemic election. Just whether we were talking about water, whether we're talking about Jordan's Principle, implementation of GLADU, there's so many different issues we could mention. There was a lot more breadth in the 2019 election than the 2 or 3 what people were treating as hot button issues. And I say what people were treating as because some of us, talk about these things on a daily basis, and it's not just on our radar when it's in the media like it is for some people. And so I was noticing a lot of shortcomings actually when it comes to reconciliation. And the fact that we are now talking about those shortcomings is so important. And the reason I say that is because of the reaction of what happened after the report from the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women inquiry, because nobody looked at it after. Everybody argued about the word genocide rather than look at the report, right? And so that's just one of the many things that we need to start to address. I'm teaching a class right now called Reconciling Reconciliation. It's a grad level class. And we are reading, the TRC. We are reading at least parts of the inquiry for the missing murdered Indigenous women. And we're reading Indigenous scholars and we're talking about these things. And those are the conversations we need to have. Those are let's talk about truth. The truth is people have not been paying attention, and now we need to find ways to keep people's attention so that we can work together. We can't continue these cleavages. It's not healthy, but we need to, I was working with a friend this afternoon at a conference, and she made a very good point of you do you, I do me. We have our own decolonizing work to do within our communities. I'm speaking only as a Métis person. I'm not trying to speak for everybody or anything like that, but I know even within some, but it's not to say that we need interference. We need space, and we need non-Indigenous folks to be working on things that can make things better without always putting so much labor on Indigenous folks to do it.
Yeah, I do wonder a little bit whether whether COVID in some sense is kind of blowing out our attentional budget, like our ability to pay, to put other issues on the political agenda. David, I want to kind of throw this to you because I'd like to get your intuitions on this. But my sense is that something like what we saw in Kamloops and then the follow-on has been so kind of episodic, and there hasn't been a sustained response to it. And part of it is because maybe COVID just really crowds out that it has conveniently for political actors really crowded out that agenda, right? David, what's your sense been of kind of the almost the patter of politics or the dynamic of politics through COVID? I mean, as a newspaper editor, you're almost professionally obligated to be an observer of these patterns, but do you think COVID has really fundamentally disturbed the political agenda and the ability of other issues to be discussed?
Yeah, I think so. Just to go back for a second, we were talking institutions, and one of the institutions is education. And if you look at reconciliation or even awareness and knowledge of residential schools, and you look at the high school curriculums, I think it's only Manitoba where there's any Indigenous teaching that's mandatory. And if there are other provinces, I apologize for that, but it's certainly not a consistent element of being taught. And so this is a generational issue where people who are 50 and 60 years of age are able to, for whatever reason, they're able to say that they've never heard of residential schools. I find that extraordinary. I've been in Canada 23 years. I've heard of them, and maybe as a journalist, I read more. I don't know, but I would hope the education sector is looking at that in terms of making more relevance to the high schools so that people do understand. But in terms of the saturation point of COVID, I talk about there being permanent furniture that is just now a part of our everyday file, which of course is dominated by the most extraordinary health emergency that we have known. The lessons from the late 50s when we had another pandemic are not well remembered. And we go back 100 years to the Spanish flu, when the media scene was very different. Overlaid against that is the crisis of social media, which is a profoundly unhealthy place to be. We're in an age of certainty. Too many people, in my impression, believe that they know the answers. And so it's my way or no way. And I think out of the pandemic, one thing we're trying to instruct is let's be less certain about almost everything that we're going through, because there are various shades to the complexities. But the episodic nature on the residential schools and on the unmarked graves is, I think, very accurate. And I think it's a combination of things. I think it's partly access. and having the respect of those who can tell the stories on the sites. Journalists, let's look at the media and the institution of the media. We don't have enough Indigenous reporters who have got both the lived experience and also can garner the knowledge through a trusted sensibility. We're trying to improve on that, but we have a long, long way to go. But in terms of the daily file, we've got the leading letter in the Globe and Mail today in the newspaper was a wonderful one from a letter writer who said, so this is how the world ends, talking about COP26, not with a bang, but with a meeting. And the idea that COP26 in some respects is an afterthought or a disappointment that in itself may become episodic and be forgotten very quickly, unless you live in India or China or the Maldives. The complacency of a profoundly rich but uneven country such as Canada, I think, means that there are not enough people getting their teeth into the issues that matter, and there are too many opportunities for too many to escape. And the choice of reading and finding out the information from something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not obligated, and yet it should be required reading. And I'm not sure how you mix the two of the obligation without turning it into a civics lesson and the notion that unless we understand our past, we cannot improve the future. And that past is more than just the last 18 months, but the last 18 months also probably needs to have a form of commission to understand both what has failed us, and we all have different positions on that, and probably more modestly what has worked. And the opportunity for that, I think, can't be led by the political class. I think there has to be a new tone and a new group of people who actually lead that, and it's probably the people with the most at risk, which is the young.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, David. I mean, I think that there's a real lack. I think even of a lot of this is about lack of imagination in some sense. We could tie this into politics actually, but fundamental to people not engaging with the TRC and engaging with our history is at the core of it is a lack of imagination that could have happened to us. We're disinterested because we can't imagine it applies to us, right? And that's my intuition, at least. And I think on kind of looking back at what could have been different over the last 18 months, it requires a lot of imagination to think about how else we could have done politics, how else we could have handled the pandemic, because we've been told actually for the last 2 years, almost, we've been told politicians have no option but to do what they've been told to do by some experts and not by others, right? And that everything they're doing is what the science tells them to do. David, you touched on media as an institution, but I want to push you on it farther, if that's okay. What's the media done well over the last 18 months as one of our kind of representational institutions, and what's the media done poorly?
So I would say that the media proved something that I hoped was the case, but didn't necessarily see it often to be proven, and that was that we provided vital information that saved lives on COVID. We also provided pattern, and we showed the concern with respect to different regions and the different stories that were being told in those regions and that unevenness. I think what we have not done well is find a way to use the levers that we would have, the traditional ones of accountability and sitting in the forum where decisions are made and being able to ask those tough questions, because we lost the ability to travel. So we didn't get to places. And this is the one thing that keeps me awake at night, is that the bad stuff that's going on that we can't get to because we couldn't travel or we couldn't see it. And there's no question, there's a lot of things have gone backwards in this country that we haven't yet figured out that we're going to have to. We also, I think the jury is out, but others should certainly weigh in on this. The jury is out on the question of how reliant and successfully reliant we were on experts as opposed to the political class. There are very loud voices, and they're not entirely without reason just because they're loud, that mainstream media, which is seen as a pejorative phrase, has taken it hook, line, and sinker that big pharma and the politicians are working together to say you have to get a vaccine. And we're forgetting the Nuremberg rulings of 47, 48 after that profound lesson of the war, where it was talked about that individual bodies were owned by individuals, and it was not to be mandated by the government. And the media seemingly is a partner in saying that vaccines are good for you. Now, I have wrestled with that a lot because, to my mind, on a personal view, having the vaccine seems to reduce the likelihood of the passing on of COVID. But at the same time, it has to be, by definition, experimental medication. And indeed, we don't see it yet proven for people under the age of 12 in Canada. At what point are we able, or are we capable of saying that maybe Big Pharma was wrong? Or at what point are we able to allow voices who don't want to be vaccinated to have an equal voice? Or are we prepared to say we're not going to be equal? And we're going to say, get a vaccine or get out of the debate. And I think that's a really, really challenging question if the media is there to try and navigate the fence posts of the debate. The other thing that the media has not done well is allowed mob rule to come into newsrooms and to become the arbiter of free speech. First time in history. Bad news.
So I wanted to broaden this just a little bit, mostly because I don't want to touch the issue of anti-vaxxers, to be frank with you. But I do want to broaden this in a sense in the following way. And Amanda,
you can write a letter to the editor. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. I know him. Send him a chat in the box. But Amanda, let me broaden this out to you a little bit. And that's what does the pandemic kind of tell us about expertise in representation? Because there's some kinds of expertise that were acceptable in the pandemic, and there's other kinds of expertise we didn't pay attention to in some sense. Not that it was unacceptable, right? But we had this amazing thing where I think we actually got, like in my view, we kind of got into a funny equilibrium where politicians would simply say, I have no choice but to do the following because I've been told by models and by, it's for data person, it's exciting, but because I've been told by models and by a scientific table that I have to take these actions. So I have no choice but to take them, right? And the people who populate those scientific tables, many of them, my colleagues here at the University of Toronto in Ontario, at least, were very good epidemiologists, very good public health scientists, but they didn't represent the breadth of expertise at a university, for example, right? It was of a certain kind of knowledge. As a political scientist, what's the good in that, and what's the bad in that?
You know, the one thing that first comes to mind right now is that this hour is not long enough because I want to talk about both sidism. I want to talk about equivalence of expertise. I want to talk about
go. Yeah.
But I actually also don't because I'm afraid of where we might go with this conversation. But I also wanted to touch, so I want to answer your question here. And I think that part of the challenge of pandemic governance, science, experimentation, all that stuff, is that it goes against basic principles of slow scholarship, which I think we need to embrace more. In that thinking takes time, research takes time, and I think the pandemic has kind of showed us what is possible when we remove the tons of red tape that, you know, some of us go through every day to get our research approved, ethics boards, blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying they didn't do things ethically. That's not what I mean. But, you know, that a vaccine could come out this quickly is remarkable to me. And yes, I'm not that kind of scientist, but still. And so, you know, what's gone on here is really quick, really speedy, really incredible science. A lot of it based in stuff that's been, you know, done in the past and has built on that, but still really, really quick. So how do we judge that? How do we deal with that? How do we account for that when we're making our own individual decisions and also public health decisions and everything else? So that's sort of one thing I wanted to say. But another thing I wanted to say, it goes to points that both Becky and David were making just now. And this idea about reconciliation and the idea of, you know, yes, it was brought to the forefront because graves were discovered and other things were happening and you know, but we didn't pay attention because of COVID and our brains didn't have the capacity to deal with these kinds of issues. And I mean, yes, our brains cannot cope with much right now. And I think that citizen engagement in a lot of things is way down because we're overburdened with just basic everyday living, without question. At the same time, it's not like 5 years ago we were jumping at the chance to deal with reconciliation. So this is not a new thing. This is not a thing that is just being stalled because of COVID. It's being stalled because of lack of political will. And yes, education is the problem, or a problem, but governments can do a lot, including, regulate vaccinations if they want to, and they choose not to on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And that's just about political will, bravery, and bringing more voices to the table that actually push issues that are really important and that can make change. And I think so. I'm coming around to getting back to that point about expertise, which is, who are our experts? Who do we listen to? Who gets a voice? Who gets a seat? What does the table look like? And if we're not going to change those things, we're not going to make any progress ever.
Yeah. Becky, let me ask you, because this is, in some ways, this is an interesting sort of proving ground for some ideas we've said we were interested in, right? We're interested in having different types of knowledge and expertise brought into the policymaking process, right? Including kind of traditional forms of knowledge or non-Western forms of knowledge or Indigenous knowledge in Canada. From what I can tell, there's been very little to none of that in addressing COVID. Some sensitivity about local context when rolling out health programs, et cetera, right? But just to draw on your imagination, how would things have looked different if we had had a more expansive engagement of expertise, if we'd invited more Indigenous expertise to the table throughout COVID?
So that's a really good question, because it reminds me of a conversation I had with a colleague. There is a brilliant woman at my university who explored how people make decisions about car seats. And it turns out when looking at those types of things, trust is really important. And first steps are always have to be around relationship building and trust. And I didn't see a lot of that when it came to vaccines, with looking at different Indigenous rollouts. I paid a lot of attention to the Métis rollout specifically in Saskatchewan. And also Rosanna was, sorry, it's been a long day, in Ontario, before the national chief became the national chief, she was the Ontario chief. And I paid attention to what they were doing in Ontario with the rollout, because there was a lot of discussion around, well, how long can we go between doses, right? And she said, we're not your experiment. Best data says 4 weeks. Whether you're First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, in Ontario, 4 weeks. Don't use Indigenous folks as your experiment. So that was the message in Ontario when people started to look at how far can we stretch between doses, because really we were trying to get everybody covered. That's what was going on, the royal we in Canada. You know what I mean? So, there was that was like, okay, don't play with what's happening here. There was no trust building that happened in Saskatchewan. And the reason why we got there was as many people vaccinated in Saskatchewan as there was, is actually in different Indigenous communities, is because of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. FSIN was vaccinating lots of people. Then the Métis Nation was getting involved and rolling out vaccine programs. But there just was not that initial trust building. There was not that relationship there. We had bad relationships from previous administrations. I'm sure some of you might remember when body bags were sent to northern communities, I believe during H1N1, right? And now most recently, there was already a misstep with expired vaccines sent to an Indigenous community. So there continues to be missteps. So there still needs to be a lot of apologies and duty of care done when it comes to how relationships happen with Indigenous folks, because those are constitutional relationships. Those are relationships that need to be honored and done in a respectful manner. And until we can see more of that, I think we need to go back to, how do people make decisions? Well, when it came to bringing in car seats into certain communities, it had to not be outsiders. necessarily, because there's a lot of distrust for good reason, knowledge extraction, all sorts of things from communities. And so there needed to be a built relationship, not a fake tokenistic relationship just to get the vaccines in. But this is why we need to be having these conversations. We need to be talking about reconciliation, because I'm already hearing other medical experts say, well, when the next pandemic happens, right? So, okay, that's definitely, a reality. So what are we going to be? What space are we going to be in? Where are relationships going to be? What efforts are going to be made to create relationships with Indigenous folks so that people aren't ostracized? There was just so much conflict in Saskatchewan when communities were locked down by Mo disproportionately. It was very evident that there were some racial issues, and those things need to be talked about, and that we need to have those conversations so we can build that trust.
I want to let me submit something to you. It's really helpful. Let me submit something to you, and you can tell me whether you think this is right or not. But I kind of have a view of this in that it's almost like there was the dog that never barked, was that there was never the anti-vax opposition that we imagined that there would be. And when I followed the rollout of the vaccine, what you would often hear, right, was, well, we have to be very, very concerned about community A or community B, that they're going to completely reject the vaccine, right? And if you look at the rollout across different ethnic minority groups in Canada, where we thought there would be huge reluctance about vaccines, in many First Nations communities where we thought there would be reluctance about vaccines, conditional upon leaders in those communities endorsing the vaccines and just accepting the science, there's no reason why they wouldn't. The rates of vaccination were as high in those communities as they were anywhere else, right? And to think that there wasn't going to be a big uptake of the vaccine is almost sort of to just assume that there's a rejection of science or something going on in these places, right? And there is a very, maybe it's not subtle, but there was a certain racism in those assumptions, I layer onto that, and David, this is not the media's fault; it's the fault of all of us. But I layer onto that the amount of diversity within Indigenous communities in Canada, in how they relate to the state, where there's trust and where there's not trust, where their integration is into political institutions, all the way down to health networks. There's so much variation, and the kind of broad brush that we paint these communities with, I think, is really unhelpful, right, for seeing where things are going well and where things are going poorly, not least because if you look even rates of COVID, they vary dramatically across these communities. I've had the real privilege of working just a little bit with Indigenous communities in the Yukon to think about how to roll out vaccines there. And there's a big outbreak going on now in the Yukon, and the amount of variation community to community is actually quite huge, right? Which tells you that there's much more variation, as much variation there as there is across any health district in Ontario or any other place. David, how can we, I want to talk about the institution of the media again. I want to talk about the incentives that you're facing, the kind of world that you're in where it's harder to do media. Do we have any hope of having robust local reporting in Canada ever again, where we can really understand what's happening in not only in Northern Ontario, but we can understand what's happening in North Bay and how that's different from what's happening in Sudbury, and maybe even different from what's happening in Sturgeon Falls?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's a pressing question because it is the lifeline. The local media scene is the lifeline to communities. From communities, you get the health of a region, then up to a province or a territory, and then to the country. One of the interesting things that we're seeing at the Globe is the saturation with COVID, where our audience doubled in total numbers in the first months of 2020 during the pandemic. It's fallen down, but it's still higher, a record high compared to where it was 2 years ago. But the audience personality is changing, and what they're looking for now in the last number of months, they're looking for much more personal finance and investing and the value in the economy as they come out of it that way. When I talk to smaller news organizations, they're still very much looking for the service news that's available in terms of both their own community being safe, the schools being open, what people hear about what is coming next is still being strongly discussed and exchanged, but that's only in the areas where there are news organizations. They're increasingly what we call news deserts, where there are towns and villages that have got no weekly newspaper at all, and the public broadcaster would have a presence, but not necessarily on a regular basis from your town. And what is lost is the ability to convene. It's the glue that connects people in terms of, as you say, the very unequal pattern of experience throughout the country is best reflected in the locals. Is there going to be an improvement? I think there are some healthy examples. If you look at the village media, for example, out of Sault Ste. Marie, they're doing very well. They're expanding significantly and they're making profit in each place. They're digital only, they're hyper local. But if you look at some of the legacy, they're really struggling. But it's combined with industry surveys time and again ask the question, do you realize that there's an economic imperilment for the media, especially at the local level? And the answer comes back consistently, no. It must be a golden age for news because it's everywhere. Even when I'm in the dentist's chair, look, there's the TV screen and they're giving me the ticker of news. So there's no issues there. What I see is a combination of both the need for very, I think it's secret Canada exists. There needs to be more transparency at the local level where mayor's emails are available at the end of every day. You can see the decisions that were made in your local town or your local city. I think there needs to be a better understanding of how much money gets spent on the vaccines and the decision-making that made in this process and who got them when. And I think it requires that challenge function to come from the street level that has been lost and partly lost because of lack of travel, but has also been lost because of the economic turmoil. So I think there are moments of opportunity. I think journalism was seen actually to be an important part of the pandemic where people could get information. And I think if we can continue to do that and to reflect the importance of that, we'll have a chance of being able to tell that story better and have more support at the local area. But it's tough at this point.
Sorry, I don't. That's very good. I was trying to find my unmute. I don't want things to be all doom and gloom. We've got 7 minutes left, and David, I'm going to give you a chance to say goodbye. But for everyone, what's just take 90 seconds and tell people who are listening what's the positive thing you've seen come out of this pandemic in terms of our politics and how we make decisions together. Amanda.
A big question. As David and Rebecca were just talking now, a thought came to me, and it's basically what they said, but I want to kind of take it in a different direction. This idea about relationship building. I think relationship building is key. One of the things that came to me as I was teaching throughout the pandemic and still am teaching throughout the pandemic is how learning and teaching is so social. And so many of our students really struggled throughout the last sort of 20 months because they lost something. And that face-to-face time, that not even touching, because we're not touching each other in classrooms, but we are close to one another. We have that chance to have a conversation. And how we learn, how we engage with others, how we build trust, how we build a sense of, who is part of our community, how do we treat one another, how do we talk to one another, how do we learn from one another. All of these things are really, really key. And they're really, really key for governance and effective policymaking. And also, as you guys have said, public uptake of public goods, right? Do we trust, not so much the car seats right now, but do we trust the vaccine? Do we trust the scientists? Do we trust the politicians? Do we trust the public health officials? How do we know? Do we trust the media? Do they know what they're doing? All this stuff I think is really, really key. And I think until we can sort of take that part seriously, and until our folks in leadership positions take that issue seriously, then the question about what we do next or kind of, how do we live together well? That's the fundamental foundation of all of society. And I think that we kind of are losing track of that until we're forced to think about it. And the pandemic has forced us to think about it. And I think some folks have really thought about it effectively, and they're sort of integrating that into their worldview now, whereas others are shirking that duty. And I think that, my hope is that we will remember the purpose of relationships, which is a good in and of itself, but also leads to so many other things.
It's really nice. Becky.
Yeah, so just to go off what Amanda was saying, because she's also making me think about things, is thinking about that with the relationships. For me, what really comes out of this is actually awareness. Even if it's for a microsecond, sometimes all we want is for people to pay attention, to listen. So when I'm working in spaces, trying to bridge and help build relationships, I try to talk about the importance of active listening. And I think that we are starting to see people stop and pause and starting to see some active listening. I know I'm not the only one in the last 6 months that just finally said, I'm so tired of social media, right? And Amanda, I've seen you put Twitter away for a while. I've put Facebook away for months now at times, because I just don't need to be in that negative headspace. Instead, I take time, I check in with my students, because I want to be aware of my current space. I want to appreciate what's happening around me. I want to be taking what I have around me seriously, because so much of it can be gone so quickly. I have 4 close friends that have lost husbands in COVID, right? And so now, 5 o'clock, I don't answer text messages. My awareness then turns to my son, right? And so I think that people started taking care of their home fires more because of COVID. I think that awareness has been important. I think the awareness, the fact that it's not, oh, more people are being shot by police. No, more people are getting it on camera now, right? There's an awareness that, it's not an increase of violence, it's an increase of awareness. The violence has always been there. The polite society is not always so polite, and it can be exhausting and it can be deadly sometimes. And so I'm really grateful for the awareness that has come, because I feel like there's less exhaustion with having to go back and explain things all the time. People are more aware.
I think the thing I'll add is that I think that the pandemic has shown, by my lights, that governments that are willing to trust citizens, not citizens that are willing to trust governments, but governments that are willing to trust citizens don't get let down. And we can go on about the 15% of people who haven't been vaccinated, but 85% or something like that of adult age Canadians, eligible Canadians, have rushed out as quickly as they could to get their vaccines. People asked to stay home, have done it for a long time, to put off seeing friends and put off social time that people thrive on and live for. They've put it off. And you sort of I asked the question of what would have happened if government had leveled with citizens even more early on in the pandemic, about how long it would go on for, but what was going to be required of them. You wonder if we could have done more. But I think there's a real story here about what happens when government's willing to put big trust in citizens and how citizens can pull through when they're asked to do that. David, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I'll answer that question and then just bring it all to a close. I think that the positive is something that's in its infancy, and that is conscious economics. When you look at old people in long-term care homes, we cannot go back to that slaughter again. But conscious economics is also about, why do we do what we do? What is the well-being of the people we work with, or we work for, or those that we would like to work with? How do we find a safe meeting place for the exchange of ideas and intellectual capital that we can put into the marketplace that allows for a proper discussion and for a true sense of understanding of the direction that we want to go in, which isn't just about the bottom line. There is more to life than money. There is higher purpose. And I think that has been recognized by more people who have, of course, suffered so much over the last period. And so really, in closing, Peter, thank you, and Rebecca and Amanda as well for the conversation. I think a couple of things to sum up: the question of expertise. What is the future of the debate? Is it left to one group? Is it left to all groups? What is expertise? Is it slow scholarship that Amanda spoke about, the ability to strengthen that? Is it about recognizing that there are entire worlds, in a way, when we don't recognize Indigenous layers and experiences that have previously been held out of the debate, or an ignorance that's either willful or otherwise. We never got to the question of the military. There's an institution that's interesting. We didn't figure out how the pandemic began. Those are questions that will continue. But we're engaged in a relationship, and the Royal Society and the Globe, we're very fond to be a partner with this very important exchange. And the idea that the more that we can discuss and the more that we can raise these questions, and the more that we don't necessarily have answers, but we seek at least a common understanding, we're going to progress and be a better country. And I think, on behalf of the four of us who've been on this panel, I think we'd like to thank everyone at the Royal Society who's listening, just for the opportunity to be here and to be part of that conversation that doesn't end anytime soon. So thank you all, and have a good evening.